All right, everyone, you are welcome back again to our lesson on music theory. And today we're going to continue in our discussion on some rules for writing the four-part harmony. That's a complete choir, right? Before now, we'll talk about several important rules for writing the four-part harmony. We'll talk about how your notes should be spaced from one another. We'll talk about consecutives and what it means and what you need to do and what you shouldn't do at all, right? We'll talk about that. We've discussed how to arrange the notes on the staff, right? And we'll talk about the right notes to double and how to go about doubling of notes while writing for four parts harmony, right? So today we are going to continue in our discussion on the rules for writing the four-part harmony, and the rule we need to examine today is voice crossing and overlapping. So what is voice crossing and what is overlapping? Follow me in this video as I explain the two concepts in harmony. Now let's get right into it. Voice crossing. What is voice crossing? Of course, each voice or each part in harmony is usually referred to as a voice, right? Say, for instance, soprano is a voice, alto, tenor, and bass. So these words could be used interchangeably as far as harmony is concerned. So in this case, voice is the same thing as part. All right, so what is voice? Voice is a distinct line or a distinct part that can be sung or that can be played, that carries clear melodic properties that you can hear distinctly. A voice could be a soprano voice, could be tenor, could be alto, could be bass, right? In other words, you can also say soprano part, alto part, tenor part, and so on and so forth, right? And we're going to be using these words interchangeably. Before now, I've told you that the arrangement of parts should be in the order of soprano being the highest voice, followed by alto, followed by tenor, and bass comes very deep, sounds very deep under them, right? It should be in that order. Voice crossing occurs in music harmony when a neighboring high voice moves below a lower one or a lower voice, creating indistinctness in the voices to the listener. So voice crossing literally occurs when a part, for instance, when soprano moves lower than alto, right? And in so doing, you'll see that the melodic line has been interrupted there. So it will cause indefiniteness. It causes ambiguity in the lines, in the voices. So at that point, the flow of the line, of the melodic line, was interrupted. Now, voice crossing is related to what happened vertically, right? Now, let's see what happened in this example. Judging by the note stem, you see that the soprano note is below the alto note. So the alto note is higher than soprano here, and this should be avoided. This is totally wrong, right? It should be in the order of soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, SATB. It should be in that order, but this is totally wrong. So how do you correct this? How do you correct this chord? We can correct it this way. So we have our bass here, tenor, alto, then soprano. So we have our chord as, all right. So this is how the note should be arranged: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, right? So let's see another example. Okay, if you go back into some of the rules for writing the four-part harmony, I told you that soprano and alto's notes are written on the treble staff or very close to the treble staff at least. So that's why this C is written very close to the treble staff, right? And not at the middle of both staffs, right? It's written very close to the treble staff. And if you see tenor's note, so instead of taking this note high up here, you represent it with ledger lines. So it's usually written very close to the bass staff, right? So it's written close to the bass staff. Okay, so nowadays, this might not actually be necessary, right? If you're using notation softwares, because all these things are already outlined, they are ready made on your music software. But in case you're writing this like a sketch, maybe for an exam, probably studying for ABRSM exam or Trinity exam or any other musical exam, or it could be your undergraduate exam. So you still need to write all these notes down with either pen or pencil, right? So that's why this is very, very important. So in this case, you can see that tenor's note is rather higher than the alto's note because alto is C and tenor has gone beyond C, going to E. So it means there is a voice crossing here, right? There's a voice crossing and it should be avoided, right? So how do you correct it? You correct it this way. So you have your bass, the tenor corrected, alto, and the soprano part in this way, right? So if you play this, it's going to be very, very clear in agreement with the previous notes or the previous chord and the next chord to it, right? So the parts should go without crossing each other, right? The parts shouldn't cross each other. It should go soprano flowing, alto flowing underneath, tenor flowing under alto, and bass flowing under tenor, right? So it should be in that order. So this is correct. Okay, let's see another example here. So in this case, we have tenor and bass progressing from the same note C, right? Then we have our alto on G, which is below bass and tenor. And we have our soprano up there. So soprano is very much correct. But if you look at what happens to alto here, alto shouldn't be lower than tenor. Talk less of getting lower than bass, right? So this is not good. You see that it will make the progression unclear. It will make the chord before it and the chord after it not too clear if you write things like this. The whole music around this place, that is talking about the chord before it and the chord that appears after it, not too clear. So this should be avoided. Now, how do you correct this? Quickly, you can have it this way. You can have the bass and tenor progressing from C, right? And you can have the alto also having the same C, right? Then soprano can be up there on E. So in this kind of chord, remember in one of our previous lessons, I've told you that you can triple the roots while you retain the third and you omit the fifth. So that is exactly what happens here, right? So you can triple the root, which is the C, right? And thereby omitting the fifth G. So this is chord 1 on C major, right? So let's continue. Let's talk about the next one, overlapping. What is overlapping? Overlapping in music will mean several things, right? Okay, but in this case, we're talking about the situation whereby a note or a given lower part sounds higher when compared in two chords. So overlapping and voice crossing are very related, right? But why voice crossing is talking about a particular chord, right? So what happens in that vertical arrangement of chords, right? In the case of overlapping, it involves two chords. So it has to do with what happens horizontally, right? So that's the difference between voice crossing and overlapping. What is overlapping? Overlapping occurs between two chords when one voice moves above or below the previous pitch of an adjacent voice. So an example of overlapping is what we have before us here. So in this case, the alto is moving above the soprano. So this is overlapping. So soprano is F and alto is A. Then soprano here is high up on D. So this should be avoided, right? This is totally wrong. But what happens here between tenor and bass, they are still very much okay, right? But what happens between alto and soprano in these two chords are not too good and should be avoided. Okay, so how do you correct this? To correct these anomalies, then you have this, right? So this is beautiful. So you see that the alto and soprano are progressing together. So it sounds this way. All right, so let's go to the next one. We also have this. So this is also very much correct. So you can have this. What we have here, alto and soprano maintain the same pitch level, right? And it's still very much okay. But it becomes a problem if this soprano note goes below this A, right? Then it's a fault. So it's still very much okay. So this is correct now. So it goes this way. Okay, so it is also very important to note that overlapping and voice crossing can be allowed at some certain points, especially when you are trying to achieve a good voice leading, right? So we can cut a slack on this. Overlapping and voice crossing could be permissible at times in such situation, right?